I will be serving as host and moderator for today's program on the topic of race amity and America's other tradition. It is really my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Joyce Francis. Joyce is a member of the North American Unitarian Association and of the NAUA Academy Advisory Board. She's been a Unitarian Universalist since the 1990s and is currently a member of the Quimper UU Fellowship and co-facilitator of the Fourth Principle Group there, and also the so-called Tomato Soup Affinity Group. She is also active in her community, in her county chapter of Friends of Race Amity, which you will be hearing much more about shortly. Joyce has had a very interesting career, starting as a high school chemistry and physics teacher in an all-Black school in Kansas City, Kansas. Following that, she taught in Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Tanzania. 2 years of training Danish aid workers for assignments in East Africa led to a career change, a PhD in international relations from American University, and teaching positions at George Mason, Tulane, and American universities, interspersed with work in Japan and Africa. Joyce retired to Port Townsend, Washington in 2008, and has continued teaching, offering adult education classes in US foreign policy, the Supreme Court, along with her lawyer husband, and also on race amity, the subject of today's NAUA program. Without further ado, I would like to turn the program over to Joyce, but before I do that, would I ask that people please mute so that there's no interference. I do hear some interference right now from some source. So as to not distract people, if you'd please mute your microphones during the presentation. Thank you. And Joyce, please.
Thank you very much. I appreciate this opportunity. Yes, I have one correction. The Fourth Principle and Tomato Soup Affinity Group is all one thing. It's our dissident group at Quimper Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. So thank you for your interest in this topic. It's something new to me, as you will hear. But as I suspect is true of many of you, the more I learned of the UUA's anti-racism program, the less I felt drawn to participate, as it seemed to me divisive and dogmatic. About a year and a half ago, I went on a search to find out what other groups concerned with racial justice were doing. Of course, I researched Reverend Tendika's early critique of the UUA's anti-racism program and her subsequent development of the Love Beyond Belief series. I admire and can learn from her series, but for myself, I found it a bit too, I guess I'll use the word ethereal, and intended to be implemented in workshops through Tendika's consultancy. I was on the search for something we could help implement here on our own. Ultimately, I found and was drawn to the race amity movement. That's A-M-I-T-Y, amity. A good old-fashioned word that comes without baggage, which I think is a good choice. This grew out of the Baha'i faith in the early 1900s, but now has become a national secular movement. Over the past year and a half, a small number of us here in this area, Baha'i, Unitarian, Catholic, agnostic, Black, white, brown, and Native, we have formed a local action group, and we call ourselves the Friends of Race Amity. Today, I want to offer from our experience an introduction to the concept of race amity, an overview of the programs and materials that are available to all through the National Institute for Race Amity, and a glimpse into what our local Friends of Race Amity group here has done in developing race amity awareness and educational programs in our libraries and places of worship. I'm going to be sharing a series of videos to try to tell that story. So let me start with a short video. It's an introduction to the concept of race amity and to the National Center for Race Amity. I'm going to share my screen and hope this works as planned. And start the slideshow. And here we go. And somebody stop me if it doesn't work.
Many stories have been told about America's dark past, of a nation founded on the unshakable premise of racism. Stories of violence, hatred, and injustice, of dominance, enslavement, and marginalization. Stories ending in bitterness and complete segregation. Our history haunts us to this day, giving us the pervasive belief that racial conflict and inequality will forever be a part of the American landscape. But did you know there were integrated communities in the American South as early as the 1600s? That Quakers abolished slavery before the American Revolution? And that America's oldest civil rights organizations, like the NAACP and National Urban League, were founded as multiracial coalitions. This is the other tradition of American race relations, a history that has yet to be examined, a tradition that grew up alongside the Convention of Racism, a tradition built on close cross-racial collaboration, camaraderie, friendship, and mutual loving respect. This racial amity was forged by Americans who held onto the vision of e pluribus unum, out of many, one.
The other tradition is something where people from different racial ethnic groups have worked together to address social injustices throughout history.
We know about the tradition of racism, and it's important that we study the tradition of racism. But at the same time, we need to understand that there's a parallel tradition. In fact, they're interrelated.
There have been people all over the country, all through history, who have been able to envision a different kind of society.
The more obvious the crisis, the more cooperation you see among the races.
An American Story traces the history of cross-cultural collaboration from the birth of the nation to the present day. Join us in uncovering tales from America's earliest integrated communities, like the hardscrabble frontier town of Covert, Michigan. As early as the 1850s, the citizens of Covert ignored social norms, fugitive slave laws, and mandated segregation. Instead, they quietly created a community where blacks and whites shared everything, from a one-room schoolhouse to public office. Discover the friendships that reached across the color line and led to significant change during America's darkest hours, like the business partnership between wealthy iron worker Thomas Garrett and ex-slave Harriet Tubman. Learn about the woman Eleanor Roosevelt considered her closest friend, and what led the First Lady to break Alabama law so the two could sit together at the dinner table. Hear about the shared spiritual calling that led a rabbi to march alongside Dr. Martin Luther King, and see how a partnership between Cesar Chavez and Fred Ross gave rise to a powerful movement for the rights of migrant farm workers. An American Story honors the tillers of the soil and caretakers of the tradition of cross-cultural cooperation and amity. Enjoy expert commentary from radio personality Celeste Headley and other premier scholars in the field of positive race relations. An American Story offers a new lens through which we can all take a fresh look at our collective identity and reframe our vision of the future towards a revival of the dream of e pluribus unum, out of many, one.
So Race Amity, America's other tradition of promoting friendship, access, equality, and social justice, is a parallel moral counterweight to racism. While we all have an obligation to learn about our nation's racist history, we should also be educated about and, more importantly, inspired by those moments in our history when individuals and groups transcended racial prejudice. The Race Amity movement in the United States has a long history, beginning in 1912 with the visit of the Baha'i leader Abdul Baha. The Baha'i faith, which at that time was centered in Iran, though Israel today, has always been rooted in the notion of the oneness of humanity. Allow me to share another somewhat longer video, which offers that history of the Race Amity movement.
At the end of May 1921, the nation's capital played host to a multiracial, interfaith gathering, the likes of which had rarely been seen in the segregated South. For 3 days, thousands of people assembled at the First Congregational Church of Washington, D.C., in the first ever convention for amity between the colored and white races. One of the key contributors to this history-making visionary event was an African-American son of slaves who was a man of deep faith, a scholar, a lawyer, an ardent believer in race unity. His name was Louis G. Gregory. The narrative that frames this documentary is taken from his diary reports of events at the 1921 National Convention of Amity Between the Races.
The North and the South, Orient and Occident, colored and white, mingled in a picturesque setting of 5 sessions over a period of 3 days. The First Congregational Church, which in past years had welcomed so many liberal and progressive groups, opened its doors for all sessions. Among the distinguished people who aided the endeavor were Reverend Dr. Jason Noble Pierce, Honorable Moses E. Clapp, former senator from Nebraska, Senator Samuel Shortridge of California, C. Lee Cook, famous Southern businessman, Dr. Elaine Locke, Honorable Martin B. Madden, Congressman from Illinois, William H. Randall, Professor George W. Cook, Mrs. Coralie Franklin Cook, Roy C. Wilhelm, Janabi Ifadel Mezandariani of Iran, and Lieutenant General Nelson A. Miles, commanding the American Army.
I attended every session, day and night. Many times throughout the meetings did with much effort restrain my tears. My heart leapt and throbbed and many times almost burst within my breast. I am a colored man. My race as a whole, I believe, is quite ready to welcome the glad day when all will be brothers. The trouble is nearly unilateral. God, give us the day.
It was a time not unlike today. 50 years had elapsed since the Civil War and the emancipation of America's enslaved people. At the federal level, Reconstruction amendments passed in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War recognized the humanity of African Americans, but Jim Crow laws in the South encroached on nearly every aspect of life. America's apartheid, Jim Crow first impinged on voting rights one after the war. Then, step by step, inch by inch, Jim Crow outlawed even the most superficial of cross-racial mingling. Schools, hospitals, amusement parks, train platforms, bus depots, doctors' waiting rooms, restrooms, post office and bank teller windows. At the same time, the Ku Klux Klan arose again to enforce the Jim Crow social order.
Terrible, horrendous things happening to blacks, lynching and burning people. And not only that, we also have to remember that these lynchings and burning of people, they would invite men, women, and children and see these things, you see. And so you had a culture. It was a celebration of the denigration, you know, of black folks.
Then in 1919, the nation's capital and more than 30 other American cities erupted into violence and chaos, incited by white mobs in unprovoked attacks on blacks.
What we see in 1919 in various places, you know, throughout the country, most certainly in Chicago and DC, is that blacks are showing defiance, and they're showing a willingness to fight back rather than to just be victimized.
This first race amity convention, then, provided stark contrast to the prevailing patterns of the era. Thousands of men and women from various racial backgrounds, hues, cultural traditions, and social classes chose to sit shoulder to shoulder in church pews for 3 straight days, a simple but truly revolutionary act.
The specific purpose of this initial convention was race understanding. Eloquent addresses, large audiences responding not only to the wide press notices, but the circulation of 19,000 programs, ideal weather, and an atmosphere that was spiritual and heavenly could have but an extraordinary effect. And the spirit of reconciliation seemed to sweep the city. This convention had the fervent approval of the President of the United States, although officially he took no part in it. The gratitude of the Chief Executive may be well understood when it is recalled that but a short time before, the historic city had been violently disturbed by a race riot fatal to many. Now the cleansing and purifying power of the Holy Spirit was at work, bringing harmony and peace to those who had passed through the shadow of death.
Whether aware of it or not, when convention goers stepped through the doors of the church, they also stepped into the flow of the other tradition.
There have been people all over the country, all through history, who have been able to envision a different kind of society.
We know about the tradition of racism, and it's important that we study the tradition of racism. But at the same time, we need to understand that there's a parallel tradition. They're interrelated.
The other tradition is something where people from different racial ethnic groups have worked together to address social injustices throughout history.
The other tradition dates back to the origins of European settlement in North America. In 1619, early colonists captured African men and brought them in bondage to Jamestown, Virginia. While enslavement grew in reach, the other tradition freshened the historically rich soil of the colonial period, as interracial communities appeared along Virginia's eastern shore. From about 1650 to 1670, blacks and whites in these communities exchanged land and livestock, hired and fired each other, rented rooms in each other's homes, and cross-racial marriage and adoption became commonplace. As history unfolded, this ever-present other tradition of cross-racial collaboration was practiced. Blacks and whites formed bands of brotherhood while fighting alongside one another in the Revolutionary War. created an underground railroad for the protection and safe passage of the enslaved who sought freedom, joined ranks again to save the Union during the Civil War, and sat in legislative halls together during Reconstruction to actively envision an interracial democracy. Sometimes quiet, sometimes loud, often hidden or overlooked, this other tradition has always been present, characterized by close collaboration, amity, and mutual respect. The other tradition responded to the tumult leading up to 1921. Interracial co-workers established the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and the National Urban League at the national level. Inspiring a network of chapters across the nation, they provided a forum for blacks and whites to advance access, equity, and social justice. And in 1921, the movement of race amity conventions began with religious inspiration. Race amity conventions were envisioned by a spiritual leader living in the Middle East. Abdul-Baha was the son of the founder of the Baha'i Faith, a religion whose central principle is the oneness of mankind. He traveled to the United States in 1912 and studied the situation of race relations from afar for many years.
Abdul-Baha envisioned a new sociology for the world in general and America in particular. He invites the attention of social workers to the oases rather than the deserts of their environments and helps them to extend the boundaries. In this nation's internal development, there is no more lurid and tragic chapter than that of race relations. It is to this, therefore, that Abdul-Baha directed his great thought, turning his searchlight upon the national disease and prescribing with marvelous wisdom the remedy.
Abdul-Baha constantly talked about the importance of racial unity. He described the whites as pearls and the blacks as sapphires. So he created a lexicon of racial or interracial appreciation.
When it came to the first Race Amity Convention, Abdul-Baha placed responsibility squarely on the shoulders of a woman by the name of Mrs. Agnes S. Parsons.
Agnes Parsons, this Washington, D.C. socialite who had very little exposure to African Americans. She wasn't necessarily what you would call the most progressive person. She wasn't a Jane Addams. She wasn't a radical white woman, okay? So why did he pick her?
The call for blacks and whites to come together for a new effort to abolish prejudice needed to come from a well-to-do white person, not from African Americans who could easily be sidelined and disregarded.
With famed philosopher, educator, and Rhodes Scholar Alain Locke serving as chair of one of the sessions, the program included talks on the spiritual and scientific components of interracial brotherhood. Artistic presentations celebrated black culture through a musical performance by violinist Joseph Douglas, grandson of Frederick Douglass, a talk on black poets by Coralie Cook, a professor at Howard University, and an evening of traditional African American spirituals with historical commentary given by Howard University Director of Music, Gabrielle Pelham, and the University Dean of Music, Lou Levere. In modern minds, performances of black music and poetry are commonplace, and perhaps even the stereotypical role assigned to black presenters. But from the time of emancipation onward, Jim Crow had been aided by a propaganda campaign against black people. Scholar W.E.B. Du Bois called it one of the most stupendous efforts the world ever saw to discredit human beings. This campaign involved universities, history, science, social life, and religion, and placed into the minds of Americans from kindergarten through adulthood that people of African descent had never contributed to civilization. The convention's focus on celebrating black civilization served as both education and healing. Shortly thereafter, Alain Locke launched the revolutionary framework for African American scholarship and artistic expression in initiating the Harlem Renaissance, the fountainhead of African American scholarship, to advance American intellectual and artistic expression. This first Race Amity Convention sparked a national movement of large-scale interracial gatherings. Washington, D.C. hosted 3 more conventions in 1922, 1923, and then formed a racial amity discussion group led by Coralie Cook and Agnes Parsons. Springfield, Massachusetts also held a convention in the winter of 1921. In 1924, New York City saw a collaborative effort between the national leadership of the NAACP, National Urban League, and the Baha'i community. At that city's convention, Alain Locke shared the stage with W.E.B. Du Bois, Jane Addams, and James Weldon Johnson. Throughout the 1920s, conventions took place in Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, Montreal, Detroit, and Pittsburgh. Even small communities in the Rocky Mountains were inspired to hold interracial dinners and discussions. These race amity gatherings and conferences were held off and on in various cities into the 21st century. In 2011, on the 90th anniversary of the 1921 conference, the National Center for Race Amity committed to revive and hold a National Race Amity Conference. This commitment led to the May 21st, 2021 convening of the centenary celebration of that first conference 100 years earlier. No student of history could say race amity conventions solved America's struggle with racism. However, despite the tumult then and now, we must mark with joy and take inspiration of this 100th anniversary of the first Race Amity Convention. It celebrates a moment in time when, in the midst of crisis, chaos, and violence, there is a present and growing moral consensus which has as its center amity and association. This moves us towards e pluribus unum as we become the better in us. This is our nation's vision and our destiny.
Hopefully that gave you a historical view. In that first video before this one, you heard Hari Jones, who was the curator of the African American Civil War Museum, say, the more obvious the racial crisis, the more cooperation you see amongst the races. When I first heard him say that, it didn't make sense to me, but recently that comment has grabbed me because I'm currently listening to Timothy Egan's book, A Fever in the Heartland. In that book, Mr. Jones has made me aware that this was what was going on in the 1920s. This was a time when the Ku Klux Klan was at its peak, when its membership included 15 US senators, 75 members of the House, 11 governors. It was also the decade when Time magazine placed on its cover Klan Imperial Wizard Hiram Wesley Evans. And yet in that same decade and in response, in the other tradition, if you will, race amity conferences were being held in Washington, D.C., Springfield, New York City, Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, Detroit, Montreal, and Pittsburgh, often joining forces with the National Urban League, the NAACP, and the Baha'i community. Over the next decade, as civil rights movements gained momentum, race amity conferences seem to have fallen aside to some extent. But in this century, as the Black Lives Matter movement and other movements have begun to shine a light on our structural racism, a secular National Center for Race Amity was founded in Boston, and the 100th anniversary of the first Race Amity Conference was celebrated in 2021. The center now convenes annual conferences. This year, as you can see, it will be in Atlanta this November. The National Center produces educational materials, organizes activities to advance cross-racial and cross-cultural friendships, does training, and has initiated a movement to have the second Sunday in June declared Race Amity Day. To date, 4 states have proclaimed the second Sunday in June as Race Amity Day in perpetuity. I know 2 of them are Massachusetts and South Carolina. I've not been able to find out this year who the latest 2 are. 3 other states and the US Senate have issued a proclamation of Race Amity Day for at least 1 year, and 60 cities and counties in 17 states have issued Race Amity Day proclamations. This June, the National Center was made aware of over 100 Race Amity Day celebrations around the country. So this movement is spreading, though it is still largely concentrated on the East Coast. Our small county Friends of Race Amity thought to start modestly a year and a half ago. We spent our first few months in 2022 seeking to publicize the concept of Race Amity and to highlight Race Amity Day through a radio interview, a newspaper ad that you see there on the left, several pulpit and church and newsletter announcements, the distribution of several hundred informational cards on Race Amity Day, that's to the right, and a Race Amity walk along our Cheech-Mahan Trail. I'll tell you more about the Cheech-Mahan Trail later. Hello? Oh, this Race Amity Day walk along Cheech-Mahan Trail in honor of Indigenous Peoples Day. Whoops, I've just lost my place. Bear with me one moment. During our second year, we have focused on educational programs in local libraries and religious institutions. The National Center developed a video series of histories of Race Amity in action, which has been broadcast over several PBS affiliates beginning in 2020, though it was not broadcast in our particular area. This historical video series provided us with the bones of a curriculum we developed here on the Olympic Peninsula, which was a 5-part weekly program for 2 hours each week over 5 weeks. To give you a glimpse of that 2-hour weekly program, I'm going to share the trailer from this PBS series. Some of it will be repetitive, and I apologize for that, but bear with me if you will.
America was the first multi-racial, multicultural society in the modern world, with the possibility of becoming a model. When we look at America at the present time, to me the most important question to ask is, what role will America play in helping the world to move into a more global community?
We're in a period of really, really high racial tension. I don't think we can survive as a human race unless we learn how to live together.
You can only do it through amity.
Race amity combined with education is the key to the future of this country.
Race amity and the other tradition traces the lineage of freedom fighters who crossed racial barriers, cultivated powerful relationships, and gave us a new vision of who we can become.
The other tradition is something where people from different racial ethnic groups have worked together to address social injustices throughout history.
The other tradition to me as a historian is looking at race relations from a different perspective. We have to look at the history of racism. We should also look at the parallel history or complementary history of people working for racial and social justice.
The kind of stories that we've really kind of lost are these stories of people of African descent and people of European descent really attempting to create a new way of being together.
So without understanding our history, all of our history, the contributions not only of people of African descent, but Native people, Asians, women, we don't know who we are. We do not understand the very high bar we have set for ourselves, and that we are ever developing as a democracy.
People are not very conscious of their power to advance the success of this enterprise.
Relationships have been the power at the heart of all major social change in America. Race, Amity, and the Other Tradition uncovers those little-known stories.
It lifts race relations to a much broader level so that you see it in terms of the connection between human beings.
We're not done yet. We're just becoming, and we are always becoming free.
American Stories, Race, Amity, and the Other Tradition is a 5-part series exploring the cross-cultural relationships at the heart of America's most significant social change, covering Amity and the Underground Railroad with Harriet Tubman and Thomas Garrett, the formation of the NAACP and National Urban League as multiracial coalitions, citizenship schools created by Miles Horton and Septima Clark that were critical to the organizing efforts of Dr. Martin Luther King, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Rosa Parks. The tragic end of a friendship during the voter registration drive of the 1960s and a murder that united 2 families for eternity. The friendship that motivated the recanting by the Grand Dragon of the Georgia Ku Klux Klan. Plus, stories providing hope today, such as Mississippi's William Winter Institute, Get Connected in Boston, Massachusetts, and Teaching Unity in Washington State, and other efforts promoting access and equity through association. Each half-hour segment presents 2 or more stories with commentary from nationally recognized scholars and leaders in the fields of history and race relations, including Cornel West, Peggy McIntosh, Celeste Headley, Bernard Lafayette, the late Dorothy Cotton, Dolores Huerta, Beverly Morgan Welch, Howard Ross, Paul Chavez, Zernona Clayton, and former Mississippi Governor William Winter. American Stories, Race, Amity, and the Other Tradition, a series of 5 half-hour programs. For information, contact info@raceamity.org.
I love that phrase. We are always becoming. I keep reminding myself of that. For each video segment that we selected for each class, we also developed materials highlighting current race, amity, and action initiatives in our own community, and whenever possible, we brought representatives of those initiatives as guest presenters. This allowed participants to learn about racial justice initiatives in our community to which they might engage. One example that could apply in many US communities, and maybe in Canada, I don't know, is Habitat for Humanity, which I recently learned had its roots in a multiracial agricultural commune begun in Amicus, Georgia in 1942 at the beginning of World War II. The 2 couples on the left, Florence and Clarence Jordan and Martin and Mabel England, brought their families to Amicus, Georgia, and founded a multiracial Christian agricultural commune as their as Christian missions. Clarence was a theologian and a Greek scholar, so they named the farm Koinonia, an ancient Greek word meaning communion or fellowship. The Koinonia partners bound themselves to the equality of all persons, rejection of violence, ecological stewardship, and common ownership of all property. They invited neighbors to join them, many of whom had been Black sharecroppers. For the first few years, the Koinonia residents lived in relative peace in their communities. But starting in 1950, the Jordan family and other Koinonia residents were excommunicated from their Southern Baptist Church for their views on racial equality. As the civil rights movement progressed, white citizens in the area began to see Koinonia as a threat. And in the 50s and early 60s, it became a target of a stifling economic boycott and repeated violence, including several bombings. Remarkably, the Georgia governor ordered the state's Bureau of Investigation to investigate Koinonia's partners and supporters for purported communist ties. Koinonia residents, however, persevered, and they survived by developing a mail order business for their produce and went on to incubate several other organizations, one of which is Habitat for Humanity. In 1965, as racial tensions and violence were abating somewhat, Millard and Melinda Fuller on the right visited Koinonia, seeking to commit themselves and their wealth to Christian service. The Fullers brought new energy to Koinonia and started a new venture, which they called Partnership Housing. It was based on a housing project they had worked on while on a mission in Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Partnership Housing organized community construction of affordable houses for low-income neighbors previously living in shacks and dilapidated residences. In 1976, the Fullers then founded the nonprofit organization Habitat for Humanity International, modeled on this Koinonia Partnership Housing Program, and that continues today as Habitat's model. More recently, author and philanthropist Mackenzie Scott, the former wife of Amazon founder Jeff Bezos, has committed to giving away her very large fortune during her lifetime. And last year, she made her largest donation to date to Habitat International, $436 million, both to the National Association and to 84 affiliates around the country. The donation is targeted on racial equity in housing. In 2021, Black homeowners made up 43% of Habitat's partner families, but Habitat International has committed to doing more. The CEO notes, with this donation, Habitat is well positioned to meaningfully advocate for the systemic and societal changes needed to improve equitable access to affordable housing. We have a very lively, successful Habitat affiliate here in our county, Habitat for International of East Jefferson County. You'll notice that in our population area, whites are 50% more likely to own their own home than non-white. So our racial disparity continues. Our population, our area, non-whites are a small percentage. We're a very white county. But the Habitat partner families are more than triple their representation in the service area. So Habitat in our community is working hard on narrowing this gap. And so that's one very clear race amity in action here in our own community. Other local things that we have developed, stories that we have developed. On the left is the Cheech-Mahan Trail. I mentioned earlier that we used it for the Race Amity Walk. The Cheech-Mahan Trail was a gift from our local Jamestown S'Klallam tribe. It's a 3 or 6 or 12-mile walking, biking, or driving route around Port Townsend, and it encompasses 18 stations that tell the story of the activities of the Jamestown S'Klallam tribe that once lived on these shores. Another story is on the right, the Chimacum tribe that is seeking to build a longhouse for cultural affirmation, a gathering space for tribal potlatches and celebrations, and an educational tool. Naomi Krenke, the project organizer, who's also a member of our Friends of Race Amity, noted that from 1910 to 2019 in Chimacum territory, it was illegal to own or build a longhouse. Hard to picture, isn't it? We're looking forward to building one, and I think our ancestors have been waiting. A third example is the Kawamoto family farm. The Kawamoto family had a lovely farm south of Port Townsend here. They were Japanese, and they were regrettably interned during the Second World War. They were very fortunate to have good neighbors who in Amity looked after their farm and made sure that taxes were paid and that the farm could continue so that the Kawamotos could come back to it. You probably know that many Japanese lost everything because they couldn't pay their taxes and for other reasons. But this farm survived. The Kawamotos came back to it and very grateful to their neighbors. But in the next generation, they wanted to pass it on in another act of amity. And the with the help of our local land trust, they've created something now that is called the Kawamoto Wapala Organic Agricultural Community, which is a multiracial community. So yet another act of race amity in our community that people can get involved in. Let me say one more thing while I'm in this slide. I have created a list of resources that I've used here and that we used in our classes. And if you're interested, please make a note of this website, tinyurl.com/Race Amity Academy, and it will take you to a list of resources that might be helpful. And I'm going to stop sharing here at this point and say a couple of more things while we still have some time. I hope that these stories of historic and current race amity in action, that with these I've achieved what I set out to do, and that is to give you an overview of the concept of race amity, an overview of the programs and materials, that a few of them I demonstrated that are available to everyone through the National Institute of Race Amity, and a glimpse into what our local Friends of Race Amity here have done in trying to develop race amity educational programs in our libraries and places of worship. Our goal remains to promote race amity as a positive approach to improving race relations by widening the circle, and I use that term purposefully, to widen the circle of people willing to reach out across racial, cultural lines and friendship to support racial justice initiatives already in place in our community. There's good news in our history and in our own communities, and we seek to highlight it. Lastly, it would be remiss of me to portray the path of our Friends of Race Amity group as entirely smooth sailing. Indeed, it hasn't been. We've had bumps along the way, which surprised us sometimes, but didn't discourage us. A couple of the social action groups with whom we sought to partner balked at working with the Baha'i community, complaining that Baha'is don't share our commitment to gay rights. A couple of months ago in this very academy, Bruce Knotts, as I recall, mentioned encountering this same impediment at times in working in international development, because there's a very large and active Baha'i international development program. Yet he is a gay man, found Baha'i is an important international partner. Personally, I'm baffled by people who believe they can make meaningful change in the world by only working with people who totally agree with them. I'm happy to work with anyone who wishes to further race amity. Another example at our own UU fellowship, I'm sorry to say, the chair of the Anti-Racism Task Force announced in our annual report this June that she had taken the race amity class to see if it fit UU values and determined it did not. No explanation, just her declaration. I believe she saw the class as taking attention away from her widening the circle initiatives. Fortunately, other religious groups and yet another UU fellowship in a nearby town have welcomed our programming. And lastly, when we applied this year to our city council for a proclamation for Race Amity Day, those go to the mayor, and he decides, it's a male in this case, whether he will bring it before the city council. And he wrote us back saying he would not bring it to the city council because he declared that race amity was toxic positivity. That was a new term for our group. We've decided to wait out this mayor. That is the end of my presentation. I want to thank you for your time and attention, for your interest in race amity, and I hope you're going to stay with us for a discussion. Over and out.